Good afternoon. My name is Jaskolski. For my AP research study, I decided to research the effect of varying genres of music on vocabularic memory in high schoolers. What is important to first note is the significance of such research. Memory plays a huge role in modern society and is the basis for most careers. As such, schools place a large emphasis on honing memory in adolescence, which can then lead into comprehension-based learning. However, many of the tests and quizzes students take, even in their high school years, have at least some amount of memorized material. As such, improving memory would improve grades and help students get into college, which readies people for careers. Because of the significance to everyday life, many studies have conducted experiments using a wide range of factors that influence memory, with the goal being to provide people with an edge when memorizing information. Examining the present body of knowledge, researchers have analyzed how word familiarity and environmental conditions, among other factors, affect memory in adults. However, no research has been conducted as to how listening to a specific genre of music affects memory in adolescence. For this reason, I have decided to analyze how different music genres impact a high schooler's ability to memorize semantic memory, specifically vocabulary words. It is important to note the reasoning for the distinction between adult memory and adolescent memory. The prefrontal cortex, which is the region of the brain responsible for semantic memory, undergoes many changes during the teenage years, which means that the results of studies focused on younger adults may not apply to high school age students. I hypothesized that lo-fi music would result in the best scores on the memorization test, due to the low distraction factor of the genre as a result of its wordlessness, flowing rhythms, and low BPM. The findings of such research can have tremendous implications, as it will allow students to have a reliable method to memorize vocabulary words for their classes and thus achieve better grades. Further research on the psychological aspect of memory during this time could lead to smarter students, better grades, and eventually more intelligent members of the workforce. Semantic memory, defined as memory that involves conscious recollection of previous experiences together with their context in terms of time, place, and associated emotions, is one of the two primary designations of memory, and is the branch that vocabulary memory falls under. Various aspects of semantic memory have been studied, but very rarely in regards to music genres, and even less frequently in adolescence. Many of these studies seek to determine what conditions allow for better recall of information after memorization. Bugter and Carden of Trivaka Nazarene University investigated the effect that music, specifically rap and classical genres, had on adults playing a memory match card game. The researchers found that the rap group had the potential to impede memory and subsequent recall of information, while classical music showed a small improvement when compared to silence, and a far better score than the rap group. Conversely, Ferreri of the Department of Psychology at the University of Burgundy conducted a study to investigate how jazz music improves verbatim memory of a sequence of words. The 2015 study used a method known as functional near-infrared spectroscopy, which allowed the researchers to examine which parts of the brain received the most blood flow during a given period of time. The results showed anatomical evidence that listening to jazz music improved the chunking of words in the brain, which led to improved memory. These findings, that listening to music did improve an individual's ability to memorize information, are inconsistent with the findings of Bugter and Carden, who found that music impaired an individual's ability to memorize. However, one notable difference between the two studies is the genre of music that led to each result, as rap music, often seen as distracting, led to worse memory, while jazz, often seen as smooth and calming, led to improved memory. Further research about the effect of different genres of music on memory would help to explain this inconsistency. Two distinctions often made in the current research on memory are gender and musical aptitude. The emphasis on gender is largely the result of a 1997 study by Agneta Hurlitz and her colleagues from the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, which found that, in general, women are slightly more adept at semantic memory than men. A subsequent study performed by Lucy L. M. Patson of the University of Auckland, New Zealand, performed similar experiments, with their variable being a participant's identity as a musician or non-musician. Here, a musician is determined by if the participant had been complimented for their talents as a musical performer, if he or she could read a musical score, and whether or not the individual identified as a musician. Therefore, in order to provide further research on such subject matter, I plan to research the impact that a given genre of music has on short-term memorization when played during studying. To do so, I answered my research question deductively, using primary quantitative data. In my experiment, I used 16 non-musician high school students of both genders, all of which came from Immaculata High School. Although Hurlitz showed a discrepancy between semantic memory in males and females, my results will examine the change in an individual's ability to recall vocabulary words, and therefore the aforementioned discrepancy will have no bearing on the results. However, due to a 2011 study by Patson, which proved a discrepancy in distraction levels between musicians and non-musicians when exposed to music, I only used non-musicians in my study. I gave each participant a brief survey asking if they personally identify as a musician, if they have been complimented for their musical talents by anybody, and if he or she can read a musical score. If they answered yes to any of these questions, they were considered a musician and therefore were not included in my study. Each subject was tested at separate times using materials that I provided. The general design of my experiment followed a similar format to that used by Agneta Hurlitz and her colleagues, wherein each test follows a basic structure of controlled exposure to the information, followed immediately by a testing session. Each participant was brought into an empty classroom for testing. They were then shown the first list of 10 words without definitions, and asked if they knew any of the definitions of the words on the page. Any words to which a participant responds yes were recorded by myself, to be accounted for during scoring. Following this, I provided the participant with a laptop open to Quizlet.com, where they were able to study the words and their definitions using the flashcard function on the site. They were provided Apple earbuds, playing the selected music to listen to while studying. At the end of the 5 minutes, I issued the participant the paper test, where they were instructed to write the definitions of all the words to the best of their ability. This process was repeated until all 6 auditory conditions were performed. Following this, I examined the completed test, crossed off any words for which a participant was already familiar, and determined the number of correct responses to be entered into tables. The percentage correct for each participant in a given category was averaged and then compared to all other categories to determine which condition was most beneficial for memorization. After collecting data from each of the 16 participants, the results were placed in a table for analysis. For a given genre, the scores of all participants, expressed as a decimal, were averaged together to get that genre's test score average, or TSA. The TSAs for all auditory conditions can be seen in this graph. The graph shows that, on average, lo-fi music yielded the highest test scores, while hip-hop yielded the lowest. However, in order to determine if the difference in test scores was statistically significant, I utilized a series of paired t-tests comparing the data from a particular genre's TSA to the TSA of silence, which served as my control. The p-values indicate with a high degree of confidence that a non-musician high school student will experience an increase in short-term memorization capability when studying while listening to lo-fi, classical, or jazz music instead of studying in silence. These findings are critical because short-term memorization is a primary component of semantic memorization, and thus, a significant increase in short-term memorization ability could yield a significant increase in long-term semantic memorization ability as well. Further, having an increased ability to memorize definitions is especially desirable for high school students due to the emphasis placed on memorizing key terms and vocabulary words during their classes. Based on the present study, a student should be able to achieve higher marks on the memorization assessments if they study while listening to lo-fi, jazz, or classical genres shortly before the test. Conversely, studying while listening to hip-hop or rap music is, based on the findings of the study, roughly of the same caliber as listening in silence. While I concluded that my hypothesis was found to be somewhat true, there are certain limitations to my findings. While other studies have used similar exposure and immediate testing models to determine short-term memorization ability, Many of these studies corroborate their findings using neurological monitoring equipment to analyze brain activity during memorization and recall, which I did not use due to the price and lack of availability of such equipment. Another limitation of my study is that testing immediately following the studying period is not always the case in a high school environment. Using the findings of this study to predict the performance of students on a high school assessment would likely overestimate the improvement in recall ability, as increased time between studying and recall would allow for more time for memory deletion in the prefrontal cortex and thus could produce a lower mark than expected. There are several future studies that, if conducted, would increase the understanding of the effects of music on short-term semantic memory. While my study focused only on memorizing word definitions in teenagers, similar investigations can be conducted focusing on different subjects, such as the application of math formulas or associating a historical event with the year in which it occurred. This would help students and researchers solidify the connection between listening to music while studying and improved recall performance in all school subjects. Another important study that could be conducted to further the understanding of the connection between listening to music while studying and semantic memory is to examine if the results can be replicated over a longer time frame. Such a study can be accomplished using a similar method to the one used here, except utilizing multiple study periods over the course of weeks before the testing session occurs. Ultimately, understanding how music affects memorization of a variety of subject matter, as well as discerning the effects on semantic memory in both the short and the long term, would help researchers and students better understand how memory functions in the brain and how this function can be utilized to its fullest potential when studying. Thank you. Please see the following slides for the sources I've used in my paper.